All right. Parable of the rich fool. Luke 12. So turn to Luke 12. And the text is verses 13 through 21. Does anybody want to read those verses for us tonight? 13 through 21.
I got you.
Thank you.
Someone in the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care and be on your guard against all covetousness, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully. And he thought to himself, what shall I do, for I have nowhere to store my crops? And he said, I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry." But God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God."
So we call this the parable of the rich fool. He's called a rich man in verse 16, the ground of a certain rich man. But then, of course, when the story goes on, God calls him a fool in verse 20. "You fool, this night your soul will be required of you." So that's why he's called the parable of the rich fool. Now, of course, the Bible has a lot to say about wealth, both positively and negatively. In other words, wealth in and of itself isn't one or the other, but that's what our lesson is going to be about tonight, is about how we view and use our wealth. Perhaps more than anything else, though, the drive for riches has driven more people away from God in history. So that's what we learn from Jesus here. This is the whole point of this context, to warn against the deceitfulness of riches. And that's what this is about. So I have five main points there on the regular outline, and this will bring us through the verses as we talk about how Jesus unfolds this teaching. So the first verse is verse 13. I call it here the context of the parable itself, and it has to do with a question regarding wealth, as you can see. One from the crowd said to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." So he's wanting to receive his part of the inheritance. Evidently, he wasn't an older brother in the family. He was younger. He wasn't a firstborn, because it was up to the firstborn to do the dividing and so forth. He would get the double portion, and then the rest would be allotted their portions. But the point is that this person is concerned about receiving the inheritance from his father, but it was going to require his brother to do the dividing. And so he's calling on Jesus, tell him to do that, right? I want my inheritance. So the context here does deal with wealth or possessions. Now, verse 14, Jesus says, "Man, who made me a judge or arbitrator over you?" And we're thinking, wait, I thought Jesus was the judge. I thought he was the one who will arbitrate in the judgment. Of course, he is in that sense. But Jesus here is talking about this specific issue with regard to his family inheritance. So what Jesus is doing here is downplaying the importance of this person's inheritance and him getting the inheritance in the way that he wants to get it. That's what he means by, that's not really any of my concern. You have law courts and you have, ways to go about doing this. I'm not going to spend my time arbitrating for this, because that's not really the issue here that I want to address. And that's not really the issue in your life. Jesus can look into the hearts and the minds of people, right? So he can address the real issue at stake, and that's what he's going to do. So on the notes there at letter B under A says, or under 1 says, "Who made me a judge and arbitrator over you?" Wealth by itself is indifferent to God. That doesn't matter. He's not against the wealthy, And nor is he arbitrarily for those who are poor. Now, you do read verses, like blessed are the poor, and things like this, and that God looks favorably upon the poor. And those are in contexts where man has either extorted or oppressed or otherwise taken advantage of someone, and then they have no legal recourse, or they have no resources by which they can defend themselves, that kind of thing. And God's going to protect people who are vulnerable, that kind of thing. The widow, the fatherless and the widows, that kind of thing. So that's what we mean by that. But just being poor or being wealthy is irrelevant. There's a more important consideration that does make a difference, and that's what Jesus is going to drive to here. So the question, of course, for all of this is, there are two questions. How do you view wealth in your life? And how does wealth affect your faith? So that's what Jesus is going to drill down on. How do you view wealth? What does it mean to you? What does it mean to you in your life? And then does it affect your relationship with God? And how so? How does it? So that leads us to the second point here. The real issue that Jesus finally touches on is the first part of verse 15. He said to them, take heed and beware of what? Covetousness. That's it right there. That's the issue. Covetousness. So perhaps he saw that in this person, or maybe he just used that question to springboard into this particular teaching. But either way, that is a real warning from Jesus here for all of us. Beware of covetousness. Covetousness is the great temptation that we all must guard against. Somebody read Colossians 3, verses 5 and 6, if you will. Colossians 3, verses 5 and 6.
Therefore put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Because of these things, the wrath of God is coming upon the sons of disobedience.
So he mentions there several vices in this list, and he says covetousness is one, which is idolatry. So the idea of covetousness for wealth, coveting wealth and riches, is making another god in your life, so to speak, and it's idolatrous. And he says in verse 5 there, 6, because of these things, God's wrath is coming upon the people of disobedience. And so this is connected to Jesus' warning here to beware of covetousness. Now, it's also referred to in the Bible, you might read the word greedy. I didn't put it in here, but Ecclesiastes 5:10 always comes to my mind. He who loves silver will not be satisfied with silver. The one who loves abundance will never be satisfied with increase. That's the way that verse goes. So it's just saying it can become something that eats away at you because you have some trust in it that is unfounded, and that it will never really fill what it is you're seeking to fill in your life. You think it will, but it's deceptive. And so greed is the result of that. You just can't get enough. And it's also called love of money. So if somebody turns to 1 Timothy chapter 6, please. 1 Timothy 6, and let's read verse 9 and 10.
But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many a pain.
Boy, he's got a lot of strong things to say about the love of money, the greediness that is there, or the desire to be rich. And that's what Jesus is saying. Take heed and beware of this. So he's identified the real issue. And the reason that it is it's sinful, it's idolatrous, and all of that is the last part of that verse, chapter 12, verse 15, and it's what I have on the outline at number 3 as the basic lesson. A man's life does not consist in the abundance of the things he possesses. So there's something that's much more important about humanity and about your life, he says here, than your amassing possessions and wealth. Now, oftentimes we don't think that because, the lifestyles is rich and famous, right? If you have enough wealth, you can buy all the security you want, right? You can buy even personal security on a daily basis, walk around with you and protect you. Or you can, have security for the future. You don't have to worry about going hungry or not having anywhere to live. So these are the kinds of things that go into the mind of the worldly person. I think the passage in Colossians said, those who live after the flesh. That's the kind of thing that goes on there. But Jesus is trying to say, that's not really what gives your life meaning and value. There's something that's much, much more important. So in order to get ready for the parable that he's going to tell, I just have those questions about what does life consist of? What is the most important thing? So the questions I have there at letter A, what makes a man valuable to society? How would you answer that?
In general, personal.
Either one.
In general, it's wealth.
Okay.
The more wealth you have, the more valuable you are to everybody.
Okay, so that's approaching it from that perspective, right? Value. If we're thinking of value, meaning, you're able to sink into the economy, right? You sink a bunch of money into it or whatever. You have that value. Yeah.
What about his character?
Okay, that would be from the other perspective. There's things more than money, right? Character. Anything else? That's right.
How can he can contribute? Someone who can contribute, so work hard and provide a service to the community.
Okay. So we're identifying things that are not really like, oh, well, this man has a lot of wealth. So I don't know how he might assess his own personal value, but we're assessing it now from some of the answers by, is he really a value to humanity? Is he a value to his city or his town or his country or his family? So these already are ways to begin to think more biblically about what it means to be a human and to be a part of a society where it's not all about you. It's more about, are you part of the solution or part of the problem? And that's really what Jesus will get into here in a moment. What? Yes.
Verse 11 of 1 Timothy, 6.
Okay.
It says, but flee from these things, you man of God, and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, perseverance, and gentleness. Fight the good fight of faith. Take hold of eternal life to which you were called, and you make good confession in the presence of many witnesses.
Yep. So he's showing Timothy the right way to go instead of the love of money, the pursuit of riches, and all of that will end up piercing you through with many sorrows. And instead, flee those things and pursue righteousness, godliness, and self-control and such, and make the good confession. That's right. Very good. So what would you say makes life meaningful? Being in Christ?
Faith, love, and family.
Faith, okay. Love, absolutely. Family. See, there's a lot of people with a lot of money that don't have any of that. Right? And how happy really can you be, created in God's image with, as a human, without faith, without love, without loved ones? There's just a whole lot more to life. But if we ask that question to some people, if they're misguided, they may say all kinds of things that are just kind of sad to hear because it really won't give much meaning ultimately. Only temporarily, perhaps. What is the most important human value? Love. Anything else? I mean, you do think of faith, hope, and love. The greatest of these is love. So riches, the point I'm making here to drive to is riches cannot be the answer to any of these questions, really. Not ultimately, right? But rather, it's how you view riches and how you use riches. That's where the rubber meets the road. And that's where the parable is going to focus on, right? Any other comment? Any comments or clarifications? Yes, Kathy.
You know, maybe you do have wealth, but are you generous?
There you go. Are you generous with it? And we are actually going to read a
You know,
that's right. And that's a biblical instruction, isn't it? To be generous. Very good. Yeah, well, 'tis more blessed to give than to receive. Well, you're thinking, I don't know, I sure like receiving gifts. But yeah, but a spiritual person gets a sense of meaning and accomplishment, I guess you would say, or a sense, inner peace than being a generous person and helping and seeing somebody light up whenever you give something. Very good. Absolutely. And so Jesus kind of brings this out. It's called a parable in verse 16. It says he spoke a parable to them, and he gives this story. And so I have it laid out here in 4 points that, to bring out some truths here. For verse 16, I have our resources are ultimately blessings from God. Okay? How do we get that from that? Verse 16, he spoke a parable to them saying, the ground of a certain rich man yielded plentifully. Now, we all know that maybe this rich man did a lot of work in planting. I don't know. It doesn't bring that out. But what is Jesus bringing out? The land. Who created the land? That kind of thing. You got to remember, God is the ultimate source of all of your things and all of your resources. And so, they're ultimately blessings from God, and we got to keep that in mind. I have some cross references, like Luke 11:3 was the prayer, give us this day our daily bread. You're asking God to provide the things that you need, including the things that grow in the ground, the things that feed you. Can anybody quote 1 Corinthians 3, 6, and 7 from heart? If I get you started, you will. I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. And so the one who plants and the one who waters is really nothing. It's God who gives the increase. And that's, we know that's in the context of evangelism, but I'm saying God is really the ultimate source. We think, well, boy, I sure spent a lot of hours out there in the field and getting the ground ready and putting the seed in. Well, who gave you the health to do that? Who gave you the opportunity? Who gave you the ground and the seed to do that? So that's really the right way to think of it, isn't it? And that will help us to put it all in the proper perspective whenever, as it says, it yielded plentifully. God gave you a bumper crop. He supplied you with a whole lot of possessions and a lot of resources now with His grace. And so we are stewards responsible for how we use God's resources. So that's what I want to get from verse 16 at least, is the principle of stewardship. It's the ground that yielded it to you. And now you have a responsibility to the maker of the ground, so to speak. So verses 17 and 18, I have here, we must resist the temptation of hoarding our wealth. So verse 17 says, he thought within himself, saying, oh, what am I going to do? I have no room to store my crops. So he said, I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build bigger ones. And that's where I'll store all my crops and all my goods. And so Again, as we understand from the context in this teaching, he's basically hoarding it all for himself. He's like, boy, look what there's not a thought one of what Kathy said, about generosity or about this and that. It's just the whole idea of, I got to figure out how to protect this. I can't leave it out in the weather. It's going to go bad. I got to build bigger barns to store it in so it'll be kept safe in there. So there's that idea of hoarding or greed, selfishness. I will tear down my barns and build bigger. Now, I do say, industry itself isn't inherently evil. Because, we can think, maybe he's thinking, I want to store it so that I'll have it for next winter to give to the poor in my, we can come up with all kinds of scenarios. And so, sure, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not inherently wrong, but we see how the parable plays out, right? He was greedy. He wasn't intending to do any of those things. God calls him a fool. If the man had the proper perspective, he could build bigger barns and increase his service to God. In other words, it's that give and it will be given to you, good measure, but you get more so that now you can even serve in a greater capacity and be more generous. And that's the way God can use you in that. But that's clearly not what this man had in mind, and Jesus is calling him out for it. And then verse 19, riches can provide a false sense of security, can't they? He says, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. So take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. So he feels very comfortable and safe. And now he can entertain himself or, do whatever he wants now because he's secure. I have here 1 Timothy 6, verses 17 through 19. And it's under this point about a false sense of security. Somebody read that. That goes on down kind of later where you were reading, Jim.
17 through 19.
17 through 19, please.
Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited, but to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed.
So that's a passage that kind of pulls a lot of these comments together, doesn't it? About, being generous, about there being more to life than possessing, enough money to build whatever you want to build or hire as many security guards as you can hire. No, there's a lot more to it. And in fact, it says, you got to tell them, Timothy, not to trust, or I think your word had hope. Hope in the uncertainty of riches. So there it shows you can have a false sense of security in wealth. It can be stolen from you. The economy could go into, free fall, and your investments are not worth anything anymore. Just all kinds of things can take place. And so we got to keep that in mind, and that, I think, to remember that helps compel us to think, I really need to put my trust in God. That's where I need to keep my confidence and my peace and my hope, is knowing that, God's never going to fail me. And we actually have some verses to go along with that when we get to the next point. Any comments on that so far? Yeah.
The only thing that really strikes me is the fact that he was blessed with land that was very productive. It's almost the sense of he just got more than he ever deserved by none of his own doing. You know what I mean? The land itself did it, God's rain on the land did it, and he had a bumper crop,
Yep.
It's something that he really didn't even earn. He was just blessed with. And then instead of sharing that with others, that which he was blessed with, he's like, well, I was blessed greatly. I got to figure out how to safeguard my windfall, and it's one thing to earn and work hard and earn a bunch for yourself. out of your own doing,
Yeah.
so to speak. I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's not all really your own doing. But this is almost like good fortune. God's just looked down on you with favor. And then you want to hoard that and not share with others. It's almost
It's
like
even worse.
the double evil, you know? And that's the way the verbiage reads to me, you know? It makes me think.
It does, you know, I mean, it's obviously more than he, you know, any of it's more than we deserve, but this is like, seems like extra more than he deserves or any of us would deserve. And I know I brought this up before, and maybe even when we were in the 1 Timothy 6 passage in our Sunday morning Bible classes, but you know, you've heard about the curse of the lottery, where you have people who, you know, buy their $10 or $20 lottery tickets or whatever, but they end up winning millions and millions and millions of dollars. And then what happens to their lives? Well, most of the time, I guess, I don't know the percentage, but I'm saying it's called the curse of the lottery. They just destroy themselves because they don't know what it's about and how to handle it and what it's, because they didn't really, they don't have any education in that kind of thing, and they just don't know how to handle it. And, you know, I think it's important, like if you're born into, say, for instance, a wealthy family, the parents should teach the children about the blessing of having wealth and how to use it correctly and how to view it correctly, because that can ruin them too. That's basically the same thing as somebody winning the lottery that doesn't earn it and never learns how to view things correctly and godly and in a biblical way. And so it can be absolutely destructive. Here it seems that it just appealed to this man's greed, his love of wealth. And so he didn't have any thoughts about service, as we'll see whenever he is actually called to account. But yeah, those are great points to bring out there. We're not to trust in the uncertainty of riches because, letter D, we're going to be called to account in the day of judgment, and the riches will do you no good there. You can't say, oh, Lord, how much will it take, you know, to get me out of this? You know, or I can hire the most, you know, powerful lawyer to get me my sentence, you know, reduced or whatever. No, all that's going to be pointless, because that's not what the judgment is going to be based upon. It's going to be based upon, again, how you use those things. And I say riches are uncertain, ultimately, because they are temporary. So in the judgment, they're all gone. They're all behind you. So here are a couple of verses. Matthew 6:19 through 21. Anyone?
Do not lay up for yourselves treasures upon earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
So that's we're really familiar with that statement because in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 6 and all of that, but that is the context of the Luke 12 parable that we're reading. And Luke brings it together in a little bit different way. In fact, it's later on in Luke 12 and verse 33 and 34. Somebody read that.
Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven where no thief comes nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also.
So there's Luke's recording of the same ethical teaching of Jesus in Matthew 6 that we read. And you see that laying up for yourselves treasures on earth seems to be the opposite of sell what you have and give alms and provide money bags which do not grow old. And so you see that's just a way that Luke is bringing out Jesus' teaching. And that may be the way Jesus said it on various occasions. You know, you change up the same teaching with different illustrations and such. But it has to do with taking action with the resources that you have while you have opportunity to do that. right? Because it belongs to God anyway. And you're just a steward of the things that he has given you. Now that Luke 6:38 citation I have in the notes, that's the one I quoted earlier. That says, "Give, and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, shall men give into your bosom. For with what measure you use, the same will be measured back to you." The lesson there is, the more generous you are, the more you can expect God to be generous with you. It just works that way. That's just the ethical cause and effect that God has put into place. And so you can see that this man in the parable is only turning inward and just destroying himself by his own selfishness. The rich fool failed to employ his resources for good in this life. God says in verse 20, God said to him, "Fool, this night your soul will be required of you. Then whose will those things be which you have provided for yourself?" They were of no good to you. You were not treasuring up anything in heaven with the things you had here on earth. And so they did you absolutely no good. And so you need to employ the resources for good in this life. I say here, wasted resources will be condemned in the judgment. The basic application is verse 21. So the parable is over, and Jesus now just makes the flat application. He says, this is the way it is with the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. And so it's a pretty self-explanatory parable. Of course, it goes into this next paragraph, as I have at the bottom of your notes. Notice the further application now that Jesus gives in the following verses. That'll be verse 22 and 23. Then he said to his disciples, "Therefore I say to you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat, nor about the body, what you will put on. Life is more than food, and the body is more than clothing." So the question was, what is your life? It's a lot more than food and clothes. In other words, trust God. Right? We tend to think, well, the math goes like this. The more I give away, the less I have. But see, the Bible is saying, well, there's a spiritual principle that actually that's not true. The more you give, the more wealthy you are in so many ways, right? In the most important ways, because you're storing up treasures in heaven. It's more blessed to give than to receive. And so be generous with the blessings. They don't really belong to you, but they belong to you only in the sense that God says, you're my steward. So now go do my work with them in some way. And always give glory to God and be generous with the things you have. Thanks for all the comments and questions and such. So we sped through that. We'll be doing the next parable next time. Thank you guys so much. We'll be dismissed.